As others were fleeing the country, as the bombs and the missiles came, the faithful believers in Ukraine pushed forward, both rescuing people and helping them. I talked to a pastor there that literally had a Russian tank in his front yard. And I said, "Why did you stay?" And he said, "Here is where the Lord called me. Here is where my people are. And as long as my people are here, I will stay."
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton. We are not in the studio today in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. We are actually connected through the wonder of the internet with Eric Mock. Eric is the Senior Vice President of Ministry Operations for the Slavic Gospel Association. We are going to talk about what that is and what they do. Eric, welcome to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Todd, I am honored to be with you and your listeners. What a history Voice of the Martyrs has in serving faithful churches and advancing the gospel. And I'm honored to be on the program with you.
Well, we are honored to have you. And you talk about history, and I want you to give a little bit of history of the Slavic Gospel Association, because you have quite a history as well.
Last summer, I was at Maranatha Bible Retreat and Conference Centers, a really neat place. And an older lady came up to me and said, "Hey, we need to go to the prayer tower." And she says, "Well, I've got this old black and white picture of a young Peter Danica Sr., who was a Belarusian immigrant who was meeting with Paul Rader, who at the time was the pastor of Moody Memorial Church. And they prayed together in this tower on the shore of Lake Michigan. And there, Paul Rader said, 'My young friend, you need to form an organization to help serve and advance the gospel to the Russian people, which was under the Soviet Union at the time.' And he did form that in the back of Hedstrom shoes in Chicago. Peter Sr. had immigrated from Belarus to the United States. He had come to faith as a young man at Moody, what we know as Moody Memorial Church, and he became this massive man of prayer. And he's taken the gospel to his people, and they really rejected him because he was speaking a gospel that was different than Russian Orthodoxy. And so he had all kinds of problems, came back, and then we had the Great Purge and the inaccessibility of Peter getting to the Soviet Union in those times. And then we had World War II and all those things happening. It was during those times, they used to say the Iron Curtain has no roof. And so with shortwave radio stations in Monte Carlo and in Quito, Ecuador, they would broadcast the Bible at dictation speed. In fact, I've met families across Russia that have Bibles, handwritten Bibles that were from these shortwave broadcasts. And so SGA, up until Perestroika, was focused on advancing the gospel via shortwave radio. But in 1991, it was really kind of a radical shift. Instead of shortwave radio, it was Engage. And it was in that time frame, especially in 1994, that Bob Provost came to Slavic Gospel Association. And we became very involved in supporting the major indigenous churches, which was known as the Union of Evangelical Christian Baptists. And they were the persecuted church. But you know, the crazy part is guys like Joseph Stalin became the greatest sending institution in the Soviet Union because they took believers and he shoved them out into the Far East to perish, and they planted churches. And the gospel went out, and he shoved them into the Muslim lands of Central Asia. The gospel went out and the churches were planted. And then, believe it or not, chased the Jews off. You remember Fiddler on the Roof? There was a pogrom, and the Jews ended up immigrating to Israel. And now there's about 30,000 Christians in Israel, and SJ is involved in that. So that was kind of the genesis of it. I came in 2002, and now what we are doing is we're supporting these indigenous churches in 13 countries with ministries they developed, over 19 ministries.
Quite a history. And I'm struck by, we're coming up on, 100 years since that prayer was prayed, and still the ministry is going forward. I'm also struck by just the similarity in our background ministry wise. Voice of the Martyrs started out as Jesus to the communist world. That was the name of the ministry that Richard Wurmbrand founded, very much with that same focus of getting the gospel behind that iron curtain. And I've not heard that. I love that saying that the iron curtain doesn't have a roof. So there's ways that we can get over that wall. How did God bring you into this ministry?
A lot of the people that were involved in Slavic Gospel, really up until the mid '90s, were those that were of Slavic descent, and most of them spoke fluent Russian, and they had this passion to take the gospel to their own people. I was one of those guys that grew up 7 years old. I had my first Billy Blastoff toy. And with my Billy Blastoff, I set my eyes to learning about rockets and about science and airplanes, and I wanted to go to the moon. That was my desire as a kid. So I ended up getting my degree in electrical engineering, and I spent 16 years in aerospace, 9 years doing a flight test of military aircraft, and 6 years on the space program. But it was there on the space program that especially I was leading a team of engineers that integrated the first sections of the International Space Station, that I was sent to Russia. And I met with Russian engineers. We sat down and had a cup of tea. This is before smartphones. We got our wallets out and we started sharing family pictures with each other. And we looked at each other and I said, "Boy, I used to work on weapon systems to destroy you." And he laughed and he says, "I worked on weapon systems to destroy you." And there was this reality that we had families, and all of a sudden they were close friends. But there I was on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, the first piece, the Unity module of Space Station loaded up, and there was we were celebrating over a 6-pack of beer and looking out over the Atlantic, thinking this was the greatest thing in the world. And the man I was with turned to me and said, "Can you tell me about Jesus?" And I'm thinking, well, let me see if I can remember from my high school days, the youth group I went through too. And so I started saying, well, there's us and we're sinners, and there's God, he is great, and there's a canyon between, and Jesus is the I remember the picture of the cross laying down across the canyon. And he turns to me and he said, "It's interesting. You're telling me everything my father told me, and you're as big of a hypocrite as he is." He says, "I laugh at your faith." He says, "I've never seen a Christian truly live out their faith." And he said, "You're an example of why I reject Christianity." Well, I set my bottle down. That was in 1998. I haven't touched anything since. And I called my wife and said, "I don't think I'm saved." I remember pulling my car over on the side of the road, and I still had an old cassette tape, for those that know what cassette tapes are. And it was from Keith Green. And it was a song that said, "I want to be more like Jesus." And I put it in. I said, "My Lord, I am not like you, and I want to be like you." And I was crying, and I called the pastor and I said, "What does a person do that is used to international work and they just came to faith?" And he says, "Well, let me tell you about missions." After that, I had made a short-term trip over, and there's a whole stories behind that, to Siberia with my wife, which was a great, brave effort on her account. And we started meeting people that were just the most amazing people we'd ever met. And then Bob called me in 2002 and said, "Would you leave your career and leave everything behind?" And I had 2 kids that were teenagers and one that was 7 years old. "And would you come to SGA?" And that was in 2002.
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Eric Mock. He is a senior vice president at Slavic Gospel Association, involved in their international ministry. Eric, you mentioned as you were talking about the sort of evolution of SGA over the years, the fall of the wall and the fall of communism. How did that change what the ministry looked like? I mean, you talked about going from outside in to actually being able to go in and meet with people. What did that do, though, to kind of the day-by-day ministry operations at SGA?
Well, it was really a radical transformation, a radical not in vision and focus. The focus is to get the gospel to the people. But at that point, it was broadcasting the gospel. It was working to get Bibles to them and whatever it took to kind of under the curtain, over the curtain, whatever it took to get it to them. And then everything in a moment changed because when the wall went down, there was this opportunity for the people under the years of the Soviet Union to look westward. And this is what they saw. They saw affluence and they saw Western Christianity. And a lot of them made the direct connection to say, if we're Christians, we will be wealthy and everything is going to be okay. And so there was this embrace, this spiritual hunger. If you're handing out a Bible, you would run out. And in the 90s, a just massive number. And that was the same time that in 1997, the ruble devalued, everyone lost a massive amount of their pensions and retirement, and poverty gripped Russia and the Soviet republics or states or the former Soviet countries. In the middle of that hardship, there was a hunger for the gospel. So SGA was doing whatever they could from 94 really to about 2000, doing everything they could to work with the national churches that were there because there were believers. God had raised up these people in Muslim lands, in remote regions, and all throughout these countries to take the gospel to their people. So SGA got focused on serving the nationals. And then what happened was when Putin came in 2002, the people began to see that you could have your coffee and your money and your career without the gospel. So they began taking on kind of consumerism. They had been infused in Westernism. They got their McDonald's. They got a Kentucky Fried Chicken. They worked round the clock to get that. They even have Starbucks. And so who needs God? And so our ministry continues to work, but we're serving the churches now in all these regions and it's expanding. And the ministries are not ministries we created, but the ministries of these churches to their people. And so we structured in such a way to facilitate their ministries.
What is the relationship between the Evangelical Church and the Russian Orthodox Church? We've heard some stories of the Russian Orthodox Church really kind of driving persecution, like they are turning negative attention towards evangelical churches and Christians. What's going on kind of behind the scenes, and how does that affect what you guys are trying to do?
In the 1800s, they had their own revival. I think it's in 1864 they got the New Testament, and by 76, I think they got the Old Testament. And people were coming to faith by grace. They were deemed by the Russian Orthodox Church as heretics because they saw salvation apart from baptism. And in fact, to be baptized in a Protestant church in their mind was to renounce saving baptism under the Orthodox Church, and you're dooming this person to hell. They labeled them Baptists not because of their association with any denomination, but because they were doing full immersion baptism. In a sense, that was this label that they were getting. And so when communism came and the Red Revolution came, and atheism was being forced into them, then Protestant Christians as well as Orthodox Christians were being persecuted. But when freedom came, they again became their own groups. And now with the war in Ukraine, we've seen this point where the Russian Orthodox Church has become analogous with what it means to be Russian. So, in other words, if you are not Russian Orthodox, you're against the good of the country and you're not being patriotic. Even further to that, if you're a Protestant church that works with the West, then you're a Western agent and you're a Western sympathizer, and you're even worse. So you are correct. And now we live in a day where most people would say, well, 62% of Russia is Christian, but of that 62%, there's a large number of people that would claim to be Christian and don't believe in God. And as I understand it, Protestant Christianity is about 1.1% or less. And so still the old school is, especially in this war of Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church really doesn't want much to do with the Baptist Church. And they have been under the gun literally since they began. And so for them, they shrug their shoulders and say, it's our life. It's what we do. In fact, if we're following Christ, we're going to be persecuted. The Lord warned us. And so why do you Americans feel sorry for us? We're doing what God called us to do. So stop whining about all that and just pray that more people hear the gospel.
It's interesting to me, Eric, the identity factor of that. Like, to be Russian is to be Orthodox, and if you're not Orthodox, you're not really Russian. It's the same thing we hear in many Islamic countries. I
Mhm.
think of Turkey. If you know, Turkey is a Muslim country, and if you're not a Muslim, you're not really Turkish. You're kind of, betraying your nationality, betraying your people. So it's interesting to hear that in the context of a Christian denomination, this basically the same message that we hear or that Muslims hear in a place like Turkey. You mentioned the war in Ukraine, and uh, what has that done to SGA's work? As far as I'm sure it complicates things, but how have you responded? Or because I know you're working in Russia, you're working in Ukraine, so how has the war affected that work?
It accelerated our ministry, not decelerated. As others were fleeing the country as the bombs and the missiles came, the faithful believers in Ukraine pushed forward, both rescuing people and helping them. SGA had to be nimble, and we saw the humanitarian need, and we have provided up now it's close to 28 million meals since the war began into Ukraine proper, and the gospel's gone out to between 1.6 and 1.8 million people that had never heard the gospel before. And what was happening, it's a modern day book of Acts, because Ukraine was really the Bible Belt. And so when the attack came, Ukrainian believers have been spread across Europe. And what are they doing? They're planting churches where there was a lack of evangelical Christianity in countries like France and Germany and England. So all of a sudden there's a revival going on. And then in addition to that, people in Ukraine who their house was destroyed, their family's been wiped out. There's not a person you can't talk to over there that doesn't have a relative or family member that has died in this war. Even one young woman told me of being raped and her friends being raped and then watching as they killed the other women and said, now you live with this. And children have been taken away. And this war is atrocious. And there's a lot of opinions over what started it, the politics, and what's going to end it. The diplomats can figure that out. But the hardship is people are dying, people are suffering. I've been over there. You can hear the explosions, you can see the anti aircraft fire, you can hear the drones. And for them, it's daily living. But I talked to a pastor there that literally had a Russian tank in his front yard. And after the Russians had withdrawn, I went to that village and I said, why did you stay? Why did you stay when everyone else left? And he said, here is where the Lord called me. Here is where my people are. And as long as my people are here, I will stay. And so that's really what happened. And so you have all these people coming into these churches who stood their ground in the middle and still are standing the ground, and they're growing. And actually, the biggest challenge for SJ is helping them train enough young men to begin going to these churches, because you have pastors that are sometimes covering 4 or 5 churches because there aren't enough pastors and deacons and elders. So they're going to all these new churches. Aid centers are turned into churches. So now all of a sudden you have all these people coming to faith, and all we can focus on is national politics, whether it's Russia, whether it's Ukraine, who's going to stop the war, the people that are dying, the explosion, the shipment of arms. Flush that all out. What your listeners need to see is God doing an amazing work in the most terrible of times, both spreading his people out to other countries and bringing new people to faith. Yes, it's terrible, tragic times, just like it was for the early church. But what we're seeing is people coming to faith. So the work of SGA accelerated along with their need for humanitarian aid, for generators, for hygiene items, for medicine. And everything we do is serving their churches as they advance the gospel to their people. And so, in the middle of a terrible time, we've seen the gospel go out to people. And then within Russia, we have very carefully, with respect to sanctions, with respects to all international agreements, we're very careful. We're able to still help the churches of Russia all the way into the Far East. In fact, there's even training up in Yakutia. Imagine living somewhere where you climb into your sub-zero freezer to warm up. And now these guys are at advanced training. We're not doing the work because I can't get into Russia right now, but they are. One of the schools we support, they are doing the training and the gospel's going out. Just amazing. The worst of times can be the best of times.
That's so true. And, we see that story again and again here on Voice of the Martyrs Radio, how God works through tragedy. He works through suffering, and he is always building his church. We're talking this week with Eric Mock. He is a missionary with the Slavic Gospel Association. Eric, we always like to equip our listeners to pray. So as we finish up our time together today, how can we be in prayer for our brothers and sisters in Russia, in Ukraine, in Central Asia, in Israel? How can we pray for the work of SGA? Just kind of equip us to be able to pray this week knowledgeably for that part of the world.
I was visiting a poor church planter just outside Chernobyl, where life is very difficult. He ministers to 75 children, and he's only got 5 adults in his church. Because all these children come from broken homes and wayward families, drunken parents. And so I walked up to him, I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "How are you, brother?" And he got this very stern look, and he looked back at me and he says, "Why would you ask such a question? How I'm doing is not a factor. Please ask, how do I see God moving in my church? How is God moving among the people? Ask and pray that many more come to faith. Don't worry about how I'm doing. I've got heaven before me." And so, from a prayer point of view, too often we worry about comfort. We worry about health. We worry about all our needs being met. And certainly those are healthy prayers, but they tell us, please, please pray in the middle of these days that they would be faithful and the gospel would go forth and many would believe. It's the heartfelt prayer of each of them. But secondly, and this is something that I really hope for your listeners, they feel it's harder to be a believer in America than it is in their country. They said, it's black and white. You're in or out. You believe or you don't believe, because no one would endure the suffering we endure unless you really believed. In other words, their faith is tested, and I would posture that their real faith is a tested faith, that untested faith is no faith at all. I don't want to get into theological talks about that, but they instead pray for us. They pray for us that we would be faithful. Their prayer is that we here in the U.S. would live like there's no tomorrow. We would not live like earthly immortals. We would realize our time is short, and today is the only day to tell others about the hope we have in Jesus. So pray for them that they would remain faithful in hardship, and many would come to saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And then pray that the gospel goes forth in the U.S. with everything going on, the chaos. Please, we just need to see the gospel go forth.
Amen. Eric, it's been such a pleasure to have this chance to have this conversation with you. I want to encourage our listeners. You can find out more about the Slavic Gospel Association at sga.org. We'll also give you a link at vomradio.net. That's where you can come every week to find the show notes for that week's episode. We'll give you links to the ministries that we talk to. Every week, we have these conversations with people who are taking the gospel to hard places where it can be difficult, where suffering is involved, but also we see how God is at work in those places and how people are coming to faith, lives are being changed. It's an encouraging message, and I hope you'll come back with us next week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.